Over the last few years, I've been travelling to remote and exotic parts of the world with Thor Heyerdahls, one of the 20th century's greatest explorers. In these films, with Thor himself as my guide, we hope to piece together the huge mosaic of his life and thought. As always with Thor Heyerdahl, the story begins and ends with the sea. The first of his great voyages was made on the legendary balsa-wood raft, the Kon-Tiki. This was more than just a great adventure. Thor was determined to demonstrate that the first people to settle the islands of eastern Polynesia could have come from America. Next, he turned his attention to the most isolated piece of land on Earth, Easter Island, whose giant statues still remained one of the unsolved mysteries of archaeology. Gradually, the place yielded up its secrets until the island virtually became his spiritual home. It was there that he first saw reed boats in use by the local fishermen. Would it have been possible for early man, in similar but much larger boats, to have crossed all the oceans of the world long before Columbus sailed for America in 1492? In the years that followed, he began to construct some of the largest reed boats seen in the world for several thousand years. Far from being barriers, the high seas could have been used by early man as great highways and given him the chance to travel huge distances in relative safety. As Thor's ideas developed, they took him further and further east, towards the very cradle of civilization. This was Tigris, the largest and most sophisticated of all his reed ships. In due course, she was to end her days as a symbolic funeral pyre. But that part of the story belongs to the 20th century. In a lifetime of thinking and travelling, Thor Heyerdahl has evolved a theory about early man in the oceans, which is the main subject of these programs. It's the story of one man's search for the key which might unlock the mystery of the spread of civilization. To see Thor Heyerdahl today out skiing with his son in the depths of a Norwegian winter, it would be easy to reach the conclusion that these northern regions of our planet were his true element. Great Norwegian explorers before him, men like Nansen and Amundsen, had all been drawn to the perpetual ice and snow of the polar regions. But although this was the landscape of Thor's boyhood, it was not to be his destiny. In fact, most of his life has been spent in the tropics, far from his native country. And nowadays he freely admits that he doesn't like the cold. But once this was his home. Here in these hills above the little town of Lillehammer, about 80 miles to the north of Oslo, the Heyerdahl family built themselves a log cabin, which they visited every summer. His son, Thor Jr., is living there still, with his wife and 2 sons of their own. Opportunities for a bracing, carefree childhood have been enjoyed now by 3 generations of Heyerdahls.
Det er meldt mer snø til natten, ja. Jeg hørte på værmeldingen.
Visiting him there over Christmas, I asked Thor which of his own parents had had the greater influence on him.
Maybe my mother, in a sense. because she had very strong interests in ethnology and zoology. And since she had never become a professional herself, she really, I think, did what she could to direct my interest along her lines.
Would you say she had strong beliefs?
Yes, definitely so, but not the same beliefs as my father. So I grew up actually split in whether to believe in Darwin or in God. I think that I got caught up somewhere in between, because I felt that, of course, there was an evolution of some sort, but who had stimulated or invented or created that evolution? So I remember that I very often felt that if you could use a word in between, it was there was too much intelligence involved to be a pure coincidence. So I remained with the conviction that call it what you may, God or Allah or the law of evolution, there was an intelligent way superior to man and to nature.
Yes.
Thor grew up in the small whaling town of Larvik, halfway down the Oslo fjord. The ocean seemed infinite, and no one dreamed that the very whales on which the place depended would so rapidly become an endangered species. Mixing with other boys and girls was always an ordeal. He couldn't swim, and he hated all team games. Perhaps because his parents were unhappily married and only remained together for the sake of their son, it was a solitary childhood, though not an unhappy one. For Thor had one passion: collecting all kinds of biological specimens from the unpolluted lakes and forests that surrounded the town. He also had a remarkable talent for drawing. At the age of 8, he produced this coloured sketch, a child's dream of a tropical paradise. His mother liked it so much that she kept it, not realizing that it revealed a gift of a different kind, a gift for prophecy. From quite an early age, she seems to have sensed that there was something unusual about her only child. She never laughed at his dreams of faraway places. She encouraged them. She didn't even object when he began to spend more and more of his time with a hermit called Ola Bjornaby, who had renounced the bright lights of the city in preference for the wilderness. Bjornaby taught him to endure hardship, and Thor discovered that he had great reserves of willpower. Among boys of his own age, he began to emerge as a leader, not a follower.
Were you shy with girls?
I was. To my mind, they were not human beings. They were something in between angels and other creatures. I felt terribly shy. I felt there was a terrific difference. I didn't know how really to talk to them like to other people.
But when you first met Liv, you don't seem to have been shy at all.
Well, I thought that she was a terrific personality, and particularly when I asked her what she would think about an experiment of turning back to nature. And her spontaneous answer was, then it had to be all the way. Then I felt, this is the person. And I determined immediately that I would have to make her my future wife and bring her with me to Polynesia.
Thor and Liv were married on Christmas Eve 1936, and the very next day they set off in search of paradise. The Pacific island they'd chosen for their great experiment in primitive living was Fatu Hiva in the Marquesas group. In his 70s now, Thor was returning by air, but half a century earlier the young couple had made the journey in a little trading schooner. To while away the time, he made coloured sketches in his journal, imagining what the paradise they were heading for might be like. And some of the other passengers added versions of their own. Fatu Hiva hadn't been chosen at random. They were looking for a virgin speck of land that the world had overlooked, a tiny port of refuge still free from the iron grip of civilization. In the intervening years, Thor Heyerdahl had travelled to almost every corner of the globe and become a household name. Now he was coming back to a tiny village called Omoa on the western side of the island, where it all began. The little schooner which brought them would not be returning for a year. There would be no question of changing their minds. This was going to be all the way.
The first impression was, of course, that I've come to paradise. I mean, you can't find anything more beautiful than Fatohiva if you search throughout the world. The red mountains and the fertile forest with bananas and coconuts hanging everywhere. So I really felt that I had come to paradise.
They'd brought with them no provisions, no weapons, and very few possessions. Either the island would prove as bountiful as it was beautiful, or they would starve. Thor didn't really expect the local people would remember him. But during his long absence, he'd become something of a legend. He found himself being warmly greeted by the grown-up daughter of Teoti, the Protestant sexton, who'd been the first to befriend the two young castaways.
Ah oui, la fille de Teoti, mon vieux ami. Ah, je suis content. Et ça, c'est la fille?
Oui, c'est la fille.
Ça, c'est la fille. Et le fils?
Le fils. Oui.
Ah
Et
oui.
bonjour.
Bonjour.
Then Teoti himself appeared. He well remembered the young couple who had suddenly arrived on his island like people from some distant planet. Thor reminded him that in those far-off days he wore a beard.
C'était avec la barbe. Avant, hein?
Oui. Thor Heyerdahls.
Oui. Alors, je suis content de trouver un vieux ami. C'est toujours bien, hein?
A couple of young Fatahivans helped Thor to find the path that he and Liv had taken in search of their own personal Garden of Eden.
Every second there was something new. So we never got annoyed. We never got time to sit and be bored. I think that it's much more difficult for people to stick together in a civilized society in a big city.
They wanted to go naked in paradise like Adam and Eve before them.
When we were alone, we were nothing. I can tell you it's a wonderful feeling when you are able to walk in the forest, to feel the leaves and to feel the difference of temperature. You get more in contact with the whole planet around you than you do when you always walk in the same socks inside the same shoes. It's a strange feeling.
Far up the valley, Thor finally came to the place known as the Royal Terrace. It was here that he and Liv had built themselves a cabin on the very spot where the last queen of Fatahiva was said to have had her palace. The jungle had moved in once more, but an old photograph confirmed that this was indeed the place where the two of them had begun their experiment in going back to nature, which so many people dream about, but so few put into practice. Here, for a while at least, they'd been supremely happy, and within a few days most of their belongings had been distributed amongst the local people. Food was no problem at all. They could gather most of what they needed by reaching up and plucking it from a tree. Bananas, breadfruit, plantains, mangoes, papayas and coconuts all grew in luxurious abundance. Only the mosquitoes reminded them that Fatahiva was not designed for man alone. Not far from the royal terrace, Thor came upon the crystal-clear stream which had served as their personal swimming pool. Here they had fished for prawns and let the water shimmer over their bodies in the golden light of summer afternoons. For a moment, the memory of those idyllic hours seemed almost too much to bear. But about halfway through, your own interests began to shift, didn't they?
Yes, it did. You know, I started to notice the fact that the wind all the year, day and night, came from the east. I could tell from the clouds above us. And also the ocean current, the waves came always from that direction. So I became more and more interested. What about early man? Before he had motorboats, when he was still moving around with primitive canoes and rafts, how did he come here? And I started to suspect that maybe the first people came from South America.
When at Oslo University, Thor had studied biology, which made him pay particular attention to the vegetation all around. Sweet potatoes, a small variety of pineapple, even the ubiquitous papaya were all established on the islands before the arrival of Europeans. The widely accepted theory that the wind, the birds, or even pieces of driftwood had somehow brought all these plant species across thousands of miles of ocean was one that Thor found hard to believe. Wherever he looked, he saw the hand of man. Disheartened by the disease and squalor of Fatahiva's west coast, they decided to find out what the east side of the island had to offer. As a guide, he took with him a man called Tei, whose father had been the last chief to hold sway along this bleak and inhospitable stretch of coast. Now there was no one left, just a few abandoned cabins sometimes used by fishermen. For Thor, the place had memories of profound significance. Up to this point, his life with Liv on Fatahiva had been a simple, idyllic experiment in going back to nature. But here, in this isolated place, he'd experienced something like a revelation. Towering overhead loomed the precipitous mountain ridge that they'd reached on horseback half a century earlier. After a fearsome descent down to the beach, they'd been confronted by a seemingly naked old man running towards them. This was Chief Tei Tatua, the last man on the Marquesas Islands who was known to have tasted human flesh. A pretty little adopted daughter called Taia Momo had been the chief's only company. And Thor was delighted to discover that she was still very much alive and just as friendly. Together they remembered the excitement of that first meeting and the spontaneous friendship which developed between Liv and the little girl, thrilled to find someone she could treat like an elder sister. When the wily old cannibal told them that the choicest part of a human being was the forearm of a white woman, Liv announced that she didn't fancy being fattened up for dinner. So they built a hut of their own. It wasn't quite so romantic as the coloured sketch Thor had produced as a child, But by then, his vision of paradise had been tempered by experience.
There are many aspects of civilization that we will never do without. So our lesson was that you cannot turn all the way back to nature. But we also learned that we're making a terrible mistake by just running further and further away from nature. If we cut ourselves entirely loose from the natural world and have no nature to come back to, we shall destroy ourselves.
On calm evenings, the young Thor used to sit for hours, gazing in the direction of the invisible mainland, and then at the waterlogged coconuts bobbing about at his feet. The palm tree was supposed to have spread by drifting with the currents all over Polynesia. But could those absorbent husks and soft eyes really withstand months of exposure to salt water and millions of marine organisms? By the light of the fire, Thor sat down with Tei in the place where he'd once contemplated the dying embers with this man's cannibal father all those years before. He'd learned many things on that far-off night. The old man spoke of his own father, the most savage warrior in the valley, who ate no meat unless it was human flesh. He spoke of the coming of the Europeans with their weapons and their diseases, the double men, as he called them, because when they took off their clothes, they revealed a second skin. Then at last, the old man began to speak of his ancestors. They came from the east, he said, led by a man-god whose name was Tiki, following the path of the setting sun. Following the path of the setting sun, across 4,000 miles of ocean, led by a man-god whose name was Tiki.
We realized the last few months when we got what the islanders called fefe, it's a tropic ulcer on our legs, that we had to get away. We depended on doctors. So we were just waiting the last few weeks in a cave on the beach, looking for a sail on the horizon, expecting the schooner to come back, which had promised to fetch us after 1 year.
So, is there such a place on Earth which deserves to be called paradise?
You cannot buy ticket to paradise. I mean, you can't go somewhere and believe that you find paradise. But I mean, if you stay where you are, and you may be able to find paradise within yourself. That's the only place you can find it today.
In April 1940, Hitler's forces attacked Norway. At the time, Thor Heyerdahl was in a remote part of Canada, studying the North American Indians. The story goes that when he was told that his country had been invaded, he said, "By whom?" He found out soon enough. With Nazi troops occupying Oslo, Thor immediately joined hundreds of his fellow countrymen in a training camp on the Canadian side of Lake Ontario. It was called Little Norway.
I was actually the only Norwegian soldier who had the family with me. And the family at that time in British Columbia included a little bear cub. So I had certain advantages as long as it lasted. It was my wife and my two little boys. But of course it was extra sad when I went overseas and had to leave them on the American side of the ocean.
The plan was to form highly skilled groups of saboteurs and fly them back to Europe.
You'll have to stay back in here. He's not...
From bases in England, they were to be dropped behind enemy lines and then disrupt German communications.
As you know, the Nazis withdrew from Arctic Norway with the scorched earth tactics, burnt down everything, so the Russians, when they came, wouldn't benefit from what was left. We came to Kirkenes, the northernmost city in the world, and the whole city had been burnt down. There was only a single house.
With the Germans now in full retreat, Thor met one of the heroes of the resistance, who was to become a lifelong friend and colleague, Knut Haugland.
So I went down one Sunday morning. It was very nice weather, so I went out in the fields, and there I met a sergeant who was looking up in the air, and I could see that he was far away from this earth or this place. So I asked him what he was thinking about, and he then told me the whole story, that his thoughts were in Polynesia, and that he had a theory that the balsa log graft, the proven balsa log graft, was seaworthy, and no doubt that pre-Incas would have had a craft that was seaworthy enough to cross the Pacific. But all the old scientists, he said, didn't believe in that at all. They thought it was impossible. So he said that if I don't get them to believe in me, I'm going to build a raft and cross the Pacific.
With the war over, Thor settled down once more in Lillehammer to begin work on his first major book, American Indians in the Pacific. This was the carefully researched evidence which lay behind his growing conviction that the first settlers to reach the islands of eastern Polynesia had come from America. In addition, he began to study sketches and diagrams of traditional balsa wood rafts, including some drawn by the great German explorer Humboldt. At that time, scientists were unanimous in thinking that the Pacific migration must have started from the direction of Indonesia, gradually spreading from island to island. But as Thor explained to me, he was never convinced by this argument.
Well, you see, most people, even anthropologists, judge the Pacific from a map, and they speak of the straight line across equator between Asia and South America, and the big curve through the North Pacific. This is all wrong. We keep on forgetting that we are living on our own planet. If you take a wire and bend along equator, you find that the Pacific is covering half this planet. And you can twist the wire, and it's the same distance whether you go by way of the North Pole or equator.
Exactly.
So this is no longer than this. The same length, and this is where you have the wind and the current with you.
In Thor's view, the ocean currents were the one clue that the scientific world had overlooked. The most obvious, the Humboldt, flowed like a mighty river directly from South America. A second, known as the Japan current, could well have brought another wave of migration by a circular northern route before coming south by way of Hawaii. Early in 1947, he set out alone for New York, taking his manuscript with him. For several miserable and lonely weeks, he tramped the streets from one anthropologist to another, looking for support. But scientific opinion was adamant. A balsa wood raft setting out from America would sink long before it reached the nearest islands of Polynesia. In a mood of anger and frustration, he made the momentous decision to attempt the voyage himself. Escaping from New York, Thor flew to the forests of Ecuador to choose for himself the balsa trees, which had to be floated downriver, first to the coast, and then south by ship to the naval dockyard of Callao. Officers of the Peruvian Navy watched in disbelief as the first balsa raft to be built for hundreds of years began to take shape. As the bamboo yard was hauled up and the sail shaken out, for the first time the bearded face of Kon-Tiki was revealed, the sun god, who had sailed towards the setting sun perhaps 1,500 years before. For his crew, Thor had chosen 4 Norwegians and 1 Swede, and this had been their first chance to meet.
I felt that it was better if we didn't know each other too well. I mean, I used some degree of judgment as to whether they would stand up or not. And I felt that if they had not met each other too often, there would be more questions and answers to give that would be new to them.
The launching ceremony, using coconut milk instead of champagne, was performed by the expedition's secretary. I asked Thor Heyerdahl if he'd ever considered taking women on the voyage.
Yes, I certainly did, and I certainly would have liked to, and I'm sure all my men would also. But on this experimental voyage, we had limited space, and we needed muscle. And I have a terrific admiration for women. I think they would stand up to all the mental strain. But I know that if we had a woman on steering wards and she was exhausted, some man would run up and offer to take the oar, and by the time we got the storm, we'd all be exhausted. I think today, with the experience I have today, it would be no problem at all, because we know how to handle the craft, like the Incas did.
On April the 28th, 1947, the voyage of the Kon-Tiki began. Among the watching crowds, there were very few who thought that these fair young men from the north, so friendly and yet so determined, would ever be seen again. At the last minute, the 7th member of the crew came aboard, a green parrot with a sharp temper and an even sharper beak. As soon as they were clear of the coast, they felt the tug of the Humboldt current carrying them westward. Anxieties fell away, and one member of the crew, the only Swede, Bengt Danielsson, even settled down for a good read.
It's true, I had a little library of 73 books, and I managed to read 72 during the trip. So, I mean, it could have lasted a few more days, as far as I was concerned.
Thor Heyerdahl quickly developed his own style of leadership.
It must be something like an orchestra, I think, where each man is playing his own instrument. And the duty of the leader is to make sure that they play the same tune. And I'm not an expert on all the different things you have to do during the expedition. So I want each man to do his job, and I want each man to feel that he is part of the enterprise, this joint enterprise. So if there is time, then I like to discuss with my men, shall we do this or shall we do that? If time is short, if we are in emergency, then I act like a military officer.
To reassure themselves that they were making any progress at all, from time to time they would throw something overboard and watch it drift astern, often with remarkable speed. It was one of Thor's dreads that a man overboard would meet with the same fate.
One was when Herman Watzinger made a false step at the beginning of a storm. His sleeping bag fell overboard, and he fell into the sea. And before anybody could grab him or he could grab the steering oar, a big wave had lifted him in one direction and us in another. And my first thought when I came out was that I heard the shouting to throw up the life belt in a rope, but the wind blew it back on board again. And then Thorstein and I tried to put out the little rubber dinghy. And we knew that when we jumped in there, we'd never catch up with the raft again, but we would pick up Herman Watzinger. And that's when Knut Haugland acted before he gave any thought to anything. He just grabbed the life belt and jumped overboard and swam holding it. So he caught up with, or the two men caught up with each other, and we pulled both of them in.
It was attached to a rope.
Yeah,
yes.
So we could pull them. That's the only time, not only on the trip, but in all my life, that I afterwards felt my knees shivering. Would have been horrible to have lost one man.
As the days passed, they began to gain confidence in this strange vessel from the past, which didn't have a single nail holding it together. They had on board enough food and water for 100 days, but they need hardly have bothered. With fresh water from the sky and abundant supplies of fish from the sea, there was no danger whatever of perishing from starvation. In 5 minutes, they could catch enough food for several days. The Kon-Tiki became a unique floating research laboratory. Some of the species they hauled aboard had never been studied before at close quarters. One day, a whale appeared and proceeded to swim amiably alongside as if it was glad of a bit of company. And for this they were very grateful. The great creature could have upended the Kon-Tiki with one swish of its powerful tail. Even on calm days, there was a constant risk of slipping on the wet logs or letting overconfidence get the better of caution. This time it was Knut Haugland who was very glad to be safely back on board. Faced with alarms like this almost daily, I asked Knut Haugland if Thor always managed to keep his cool.
Well, I think we all had, when we had been out for a couple of months, a few days where we were rather tired, and he had that feeling too. I think he wasn't always so good humor, but apart from that, he was always the perfect leader, no doubt about that.
Living at such close quarters, did the tempers of the others sometimes wear a bit thin?
No, I wouldn't say that at all. I think that we had very different opinions on many main questions. But this is not the main issue of making men work together. It's, if you have trouble, it's the little thing. If a man is spilling sugar in the sleeping bag of another one, or if he gets his fish hook in the pants of another one, that's the time you have an explosion and you have to calm them down. But you can discuss politics and anything, and we appreciate that the other man has another idea.
Throughout the voyage, no ship came anywhere near them, but they were not completely isolated. Occasionally, they would inflate a balloon with a radio aerial attached to it. This was their only link with the 20th century. In every other respect, life seemed as timeless as the ocean surrounding them.
Well, I can tell you this, that all of us that had spent 101 days on a raft in touch with sea and water, we felt as we were part of the universe. Cities and nations were not there. We were human beings, and there was our planet and the universe. It was a very, very strange feeling that I know all my men, it gave us a lot. It made us feel very, very modest on this enormous space that we have around us. And we understood that we were very unimportant, and even the whole planet and the whole setup.
Would you call that a spiritual experience?
Yes, I think we'd call it that, and I think it's something we all felt very strongly.
People imagine that we're hanging on to those logs, fearing for our lives, risking being washed overboard and so on. On the contrary, But let us say the memory that I keep and that I cherish most is this feeling of peace and calm. I mean, for 3 months we were cut off from the rest of the world. We didn't see any ships. We rarely spoke to any radio stations and so on. And we had this wonderful feeling of peace. I think the cosmonauts perhaps, have the same feeling today.
Thor had warned his crew that they must expect to go through a period of depression, brought on by their cramped and isolated condition, and that endless watery horizon. But if they did, each man managed to conceal it from the others. Meanwhile, there were matters of much more immediate concern. How long would the balsa logs float? Was it possible they might sail right through the islands without ever sighting land? Down below, seaweed, clinging to the raft's bottom, had already become a safe haven for several varieties of small fish. But it was no haven at all for humans once the marauding sharks began to move in. For all their good intentions to be at peace with the world, sharks appeared to have been cast by nature in the role of the enemy. To give themselves some kind of protection, they devised a kind of basket made of ropes and bamboo. It wasn't much, but just enough to make the monsters have second thoughts before launching into an attack. Then, one day, they had a visitor of altogether different proportions. This was a whale shark, the largest known fish in the ocean, and one of the rarest. At least 60 feet long, it circled the raft for an hour or more, until Eric Hesselberg could stand it no more, and hurled a harpoon at its head, which sent the creature diving into the depths of the ocean. At the end of July, after 3 months at sea, they saw their first bird. It could only mean that land was not far away. They didn't have long to wait. A few days later, they heard the unmistakable roar of the surf, hurling itself at the reef surrounding an atoll. Whatever happened now, they knew that they'd crossed 4,000 miles of ocean in 101 days, and the Kon-Tiki was still intact. But now she was confronted by the greatest hazard of the entire voyage. At the mercy of the treacherous currents which swirled around the islands, they found themselves bearing down towards a reef nearly 50 miles long.
These last hours were terrible because we were stopped by the reef and the waves broke over the raft and we had to hang on, and well, it was very unpleasant.
The waves are enormous. They come all the way from South America, always with one direction. So when they hit the reef, the vertical surf was higher than the top of the mast. And we were just like little ants. I think most of the men saved their lives by crawling into the bamboo hut, which collapsed on top of them. But a couple of us were hanging in the ropes, and it's almost a miracle that we were washed back on board again because we hang on to the ropes. And that was a nightmare. I can really, I'll never forget that moment.
That landing was terrible, and I shall never forget that when the mast broke and we got these enormous breakers coming all over the raft, and we were just hanging on to the ropes. And then we were thrown about 60 meters up on the reef. And then we were real happy when we waded ashore to that lonely island, Rauruia.
The crisis was over. Lifted out of her element, Kon-Tiki lay stranded on top of the reef surrounding Rauruia atoll. Not one of the crew had been lost or even seriously hurt.
It was so fantastic to wade ashore we were washed all the way up on the reef, and we could wade up and put our feet in dry, warm sand and walk on something that was stable after 101 days. So that was like coming straight from hell to heaven, and with white birds flying above us and coconut palms. And I'll never forget that either.
As one of the crew remarked, purgatory was a bit damp, but heaven is more or less as I'd imagined it. The first task was to make radio contact with the outside world. The second was to plant a coconut from the South American mainland. A week later, a group of astonished islanders crossed the lagoon from the main island of Rauruia. No one before had ever landed on the windward side of the atoll, where any normal vessel would be smashed to pieces. They didn't know it then, but this battered wreck of bamboo and balsa wood was to become one of the most celebrated vessels in maritime history. As for Thor Heyerdahl, he had done what he set out to do, demonstrating to the scientific world that the first people to reach the islands of eastern Polynesia could have come by the same route. But this was not the end of the quest. It was just the beginning.